What else do you need to see?
Well, I'm gonna need evidence of telekinesis, abnormal strength.
Richard.
Detect when dying young women's female
Is that good enough for you?
Yeah,
that's good enough for me.
I haven't seen The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Yeah, I expect to hear that a lot as we look through the Asylum's catalog. Most of the movies the studios base their mockbusters around, I haven't actually seen before watching their cash-ins. You could make the valid complaint that I should watch the actual thing, both to broaden my palette and to compare and contrast to the Asylum's take on the subject. But then I'd argue that they themselves haven't seen the movie they're ripping off, and the point of their mockbusters is to get them on shelves before the actual thing is released. For most cases, they probably just wanted to make their own take on the subject and genre, and they slapped on a title similar to that mainstream movie currently in theaters after the fact. So there's not really a reason to compare and contrast, since any similarities are purely coincidental. Except for when they do blatantly copy other media, but it's usually from things unrelated to what they're cashing in on. So I apologize if I have to start these videos saying I haven't seen the real thing and I have no opinion on it. I'll still summarize it and give it a few thoughts, but for these instances, the opening may end up shorter than usual. You can decide for yourselves if that's a blessing or not. Anyway, The Exorcism of Emily Rose is, well, an exorcism movie. Released in 2005, it deals with the court case of Father Moore, a Catholic priest charged with the homicide of the titular character, a young woman allegedly possessed by multiple evil spirits, and his defense that she was totally the victim of demonic possession for reals and he's not a negligent quack. It was apparently based on the real-life account of Annalise Michel, and while neither story ends happily, the movie might as well have been Care Bears compared to the real thing. From what I hear, it's pretty good, at least for a PG-13 horror movie, with critics like Roger Ebert giving it high marks, and it's one of the movies credited for reinvigorating the market for more possession flicks, like Requiem, The Last Exorcism, The Rite, The Conjuring, and of course, later Asylum movies. While today it's mostly been pushed to the side in favor of larger supernatural franchises, it does sound interesting, and I recognize that it has its fans. If you like this movie, great! I haven't seen it, but it sounds like a spiritual experience. Of course, if that movie is anywhere near as nuts as what I just watched, I might have to check it out. Exorcism, The Possession of Gail Bowers, is the Asylum's first take on an Exorcist movie, and it's something. Something good, something bad, I can't really decide. I don't even really have an intro for a lead-in, and I think I've already exceeded my opening Ramba quota, so let's dive in and see what possessed them to make this flick. Gail Bowers is a young woman who moves in with her older sister and brother-in-law after the death of her parents. Her sister, Anne, wants her to attend church and go to a Christian college, but Gail's not on board with all that spiritual stuff. And, for her lack of belief, she's possessed by an evil spirit, who slowly begins to take over her body while tormenting her with nightmares and visions of carnal desires and death. As Gail and her life unravel and she begins to attack her family, Anne and her husband must determine if the cause is medical, or if the only cure is one of a supernatural nature. Will Gail succeed in having the evil purged from her body? Is this still a funnier Exorcist movie than Repossessed? So from how I've described it, it sounds like a standard affliction plot. A character is possessed or cursed or inflicted with a disease or something else that greatly affects them, and they get worse and worse as the movie goes until they're either cured, dead, or, in this case of this movie, something else entirely. And for the most part, yeah, that's what happens. Gail is possessed with an evil spirit and slowly loses her identity, while also gaining scary demon powers to wreck everyone's shit. And hey, we get an Asylum movie with actual progression, where we're at a different point 40 minutes into the flick than we were at the beginning, so that's a rarity. So right off the bat, the plot structure is 10 times better than most of the other schlock featured so far. But that doesn't mean the writing is good and that we don't get some hiccups, let's call them. One of the major hiccups actually happens in the first 20 minutes, where I swear they got a few pages of the script mixed around. After Gail moves in with Anne and Anne's husband Clark, she's hounded at the dinner table to go to a Christian academy, says she wants nothing to do with it, and she's possessed by a demon as she sleeps. Then the next day, a complete stranger shows up, she's instantly friends with Gail, and they perform a seance with a Ouija board later that night, which also frees evil spirits, one of whom possesses the friend. Shouldn't this scene have come first? Wouldn't it have flowed much more naturally if the friend had shown up when Gail first moved in, they performed the seance, and that's what leads to Gail and her friend getting possessed? Otherwise, the spirit board scene is practically pointless, since then the board isn't actually connected to the demons or the possession and only serves as... No, actually it serves no point. It's not scary, it doesn't reveal anything, and could have been cut with nothing missing. The only reason it's here is so Anne can berate Gail for using it, because she's Christian, you know, and so the friend can come back and get it. And I guess it possesses the friend as well, which gives it all the more reason why this scene should have been placed earlier. What, were they worried their movie would be seen as too similar to the actual Ouija movie? Oh wait, that wasn't even conceived yet. Not even the 2007 Filipino flick of the same name. So no, there was no reason to have the movie structured this way. Well, except for padding, fill the runtime. Speaking of the friend and weird decisions, there is literally no reason to make her a complete stranger. Yeah, she just appears about 10 minutes in and introduces herself to Gail, and they're hanging out and performing black magic by that night. And Anne and Clark talk about her like she's a longtime acquaintance, and this is just a normal thing between her and Gail. Which, if that's how the situation's being portrayed, why not just have her be a longtime friend of Gail? Say that she's a friend from where Gail used to live, and she tracked Gail down after she moved just to say hi. I'm sorry, but even for a movie about evil spirits, this amount of trust and chemistry between people who have known each other for literally only a few hours is the most far-fetched scenario presented in the flick. Unless you're Mabel from Gravity Falls, or my mom. After the movie's odd first act, the plot unfortunately starts to settle into routine. Repetitive, boring, filler, routine. It's similar to the repetition we just had to deal with from the last two movies we looked at. Gail does something weird, Anne and Clark talk about it. Gail does something weird, Anne and Clark talk about it. Gail does something weird, Anne and Clark talk about it. And there's your next 50 minutes, of which all but 90 seconds take place in or around the same house. So get used to these pasty white walls, sterile countertops, and attic boards, because you're going to be seeing them for 75% of the movie. But okay, as series like Paranormal Activity have shown us, having a horror movie almost entirely based inside a small house isn't a bad idea. As long as they can scrounge up some scares and set a suitably spooky atmosphere, a movie shot pretty much anywhere can still be engaging and terrifying. Too bad this movie isn't scary. Now, this being a movie about demonic possession, you'd expect that the scares would come from, well, the one possessed. The one acting erratically, saying or doing weird things that start subtle and get more and more insane as the movie goes, and where it's left ambiguous what Gail's doing and what the demon is making her do. You know, make it psychological and subtle, where the horror comes from the performances of the actors and how it contrasts against their characters' personalities and surroundings in a way that would require personality and surroundings. And with the bland empty house and the 1 to no cutouts making up the screen time, you'd have better luck finding an actual demon in the flesh than a fleshed out character. No, instead of the horror coming from interesting characters and relatable situations, the movie decides to fall back on, well, what sadly 95% of all horror movies seem to try to pass off as scary: gore and jump scares. So every time the movie wants to be seen as dark and terrifying, it'll stab someone, or have someone bleed down a drain, or crush someone's head, or simply have a demon scratch a dude. You know, confuse actual terror that'll freeze you in place and glue you to the screen with gross and disturbing content that'll just make you want to turn the movie off and find something worthwhile to do with your time. Maybe with some titties thrown in for good measure, because what's torture and death without a little sex appeal? And yep, it's one of those movies, especially from around the mid to late 2000s, where they think putting sudden loud noises over sudden cuts equals scary. When no, jump scares have not and never will be scary. Scary is emotion, scary lingers, scary provides an atmosphere of unease throughout, leaving feelings that persist long after the movie ends. Scary is a massive, unthinkable eye-in-the-sky looking down at you creature who will devour your planet as passively as someone popping a malt ball in their mouth, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. At least it is for me. Jump scares are startling, something that gives you a quick shock, then leaves. Yes, they'll get your heart pumping for a few seconds, and you may let out a quick gasp or scream, but then you're left with nothing afterwards. Other than maybe fleeting rage and a desire to punch whoever thought that was a good idea. Any kind of media reliant on jump scares to get a jolt from its audience has the same maturity level as your brother jumping out from behind a door and going. Yet surprisingly, and somewhat thankfully, the movie doesn't exploit its cheap scares as much as you'd expect. There's maybe only 2 jump scares in the entire movie, and, besides the beginning and ending, maybe 4 or 5 brief shots of blood and gore. So the movie isn't as gross and annoying as you'd think. Though that's also a hint as to how hard they tried with the movie's scare factor. Alright, I guess I can't be that cruel. They did try. I can tell there was some effort to make some parts of this movie scary, especially Gail's demonic possession. After being possessed, again for reasons never really given, she starts to act very erratically, like going outside and sitting in the cold for no reason, screaming and swearing at her friends and family, and tossing and turning in bed like me trying to sleep after all-you-can-eat spicy nachos. Alright, now that I say it out loud, it sounds like regular behavior for a girl in her late teens, but they make it look weird. And yes, as I alluded to earlier, there is progression. Or regression, I should say, as Gail's condition visibly gets worse and worse, going from nightmares and insomnia to leaving bloody nail imprints in her palms to, super strength, levitation, and scary demon voice. Everything you'd expect from a demonic possession is here, and pulled off with competence. But again, while it's presented okay, it's just not scary. We don't know enough about Gail for these sudden outbursts and out-of-character moments to take full effect. Because, again, that will require character. We're given practically nothing about Gail or her history, besides that she apparently doesn't want to go to church and, for a sin of free will, was possessed by a demon. We don't know what she's actually like, just that she gets cranky when she doesn't sleep, she's violent when she's possessed, and she's confused when she's not. So when she acts out, I'm not sure if these aren't things she'd do normally. Even when she's possessed and trying to seduce her brother-in-law, promising to let him do dirty things he couldn't with his wife, it just kinda sounds like the desperation of a horny virgin teenager. Especially one who went through the trauma of dead parents and is now forced to live under the same roof as Christian conservatives trying to dictate her life. Now, if she was 12 years old and demanding sex from an adult, then yeah, that would be creepy. But here, we don't know enough about anyone to know if they see this as wrong. If you're going to include this in the plot, then why not actually establish a connection between Gail and Clark? Have regular Gail show some feelings toward Clark, that he turns her on and he's a guy that she'd want as a partner, but she has too much respect towards her sister to destroy their relationship. Then when she's possessed, the demon pushes her to act on her forbidden desires and force herself on him. Then we'd have more of a reason for Gail to want Clark, for Clark to be nervous and uncertain, and for a wedge to be driven between Clark and Anne. Or hey, make Clark a bit of a sleazebag and show him having feelings for Gail. Have a scene early on where he makes a pass at Gail and it's clear that she's not interested. Then, when Gail's tempting Clark, he can be caught completely off guard and have no idea to react. Once again, making Clark nervous around Gail and suspicious of Clark and having them question their marriage. There's a lot that could be done with this idea to create tension and keep the audience guessing. But instead, the dialogue's just there for shock value. Like someone heard the profanity and sexual threats Demon Reagan was spouting in The Exorcist and figured it would sound just as scary coming from a 20-year-old as it did a 12-year-old. And the result has as much creep factor as if instead of Kathy Bates in Misery, we got Marie Osmond. Speaking of Gail, she's played by Erica Kessler, making her screen debut with this movie. And for a first performance in the movie of this status, it's actually impressive. I totally buy that she's a teenager scarred by the death of her parents, who doesn't want to put up with her sister and her devout and controlling attitude, and that she's being tortured by an evil spirit that decided to make her its vessel. When she needs to be confused and innocent, she's confused and innocent. When she needs to be a bad girl, she's a bad girl. When she needs to look like she hasn't slept in days, she looks ready to collapse at any second. And when she needs to act like the devil itself, well...
Hi, Gail's not here.
Well, who am I talking to?
That is the question,
isn't it?
Gail, if you can hear me, we're gonna help you.
She can't hear you. She is so scared. Poor little bitch is terrified.
Your mother's in here with his carrot. Would you like to leave a message?
Okay, it's not perfect. There are quite a few scenes where acting is underplayed and feels like a first-take script reading, but that's how most of the people in this movie act anyway. And if anything, her performance is the one that stands out the most. Like everyone, she's not given that much to work with, but like a few other actors featured here, what she is given, she knocks out of the park. Especially while playing someone possessed, which, as people who have featured in Exorcist movies have related, is notoriously laborious, and often doesn't end without a few scars and bruises. She'd go on to an almost exclusive asylum filmography all made over the next year, before finding her true calling as a producer for reality TV, most notably The Amazing Race. So hey, yet another success story with ties to the asylum. Always good to see something beautiful grow out of a garbage heap. Gail's sister Anne is played by Noelle Thurman, who previously featured in Beast of Bray Road, and who has a couple more Asylum and Leigh Scott productions to get to. She plays a devout Christian. How do we know she's a devout Christian? Because that's 75% of her dialogue. Every other scene, and sometimes even every other sentence, she's spouting something about God or church or the evils of man and all that other conservative Christian junk that just makes you want to scream, "Shut up!"
You were playing with a Ouija board? Where did you get it?
Gail, you know how I feel about those things. I don't want it in my house. But you're dabbling in the occult when you play with that. When you play with that game, you're opening the doors for dark spirits and the devil. In the Bible, it clearly states...
And you know
in the
how I
book-
feel about the Bible.
And Harry Potter and all his wizard friends went straight to hell for practicing witchcraft.
It's just a one-dimensional, somewhat antagonistic portrayal of a religious person that horror movies like to include. A portrayal I praise them for not stooping to in War of the Worlds. And she doesn't really contribute much to the movie other than being the God-fearing Christian. She's the first one to agree to an exorcism for Gail, and she starts to doubt her relationship with her husband thanks to Gail's actions. But it doesn't go anywhere. She just acts worried and often defensive, and she's there for Gail at the end. Not for emotional support or to turn the tides, she's just there. Still, at least she didn't die, like the religious nut does in every other horror movie. Probably the only cliche card this movie didn't play. Anne's husband Clark is played by the ever-talented Griff First, whom we haven't seen since Jolly Roger and not in a main role since Dead Men Walking. And while I'm always glad to see this guy, I don't get why he's here. While he brings the charm and the 110% he always delivers, his character is probably the most pointless in the whole movie. Literally all he does is agree with Anne, go to work, and get hit on by Gail. That's it! The only time he's an obstacle or shows free will is when he questions Anne's decision to hire an exorcist, which he's later completely on board with after Gail nearly strangles him. He could have been cut from this movie entirely and nothing would be missing. In fact, I think the movie does just that, as by the third act, he's gone. Never mentioned again. Doesn't even show up at the end. He was so pointless, the movie pulled a gumball and dragged him into the void, erasing everyone's memory of his existence. He's the movie's biggest wasted opportunity. As I suggested earlier, there were places where he could have had a point, and even a spot where his disappearance could have been explained. There's a scene where Clark and Anne are banging, while a jealous Gail listens and fantasizes Clark screwing her instead. Well, why not just have that be what actually happened? Have Clark think that he's having sex with his wife, only to suddenly reveal he's actually with Gail. I don't know if illusion is a power included with the complete possession package, but they're obviously making up as they go, so why stop now? Clark freaks out, Anne rushes in, sees the act, flips her shit. Then Gail goes full crazy, tries to kill Anne, and Anne decides it's time for Max von Sydow to make a house call, wrapping up the arc that Clark and Gail should have had and explaining why Clark just ghosted the flick. It would have been an easy fix. Instead, Clark is just there for Anne to say things to, and the movie eventually forgets it had a Clark. Griff's 5 seconds in Terminator Genesis were more worth his time. And appearing as our exorcist for this movie is frequent Asylum collaborator Thomas Downey, playing Father Thomas Bates. According to the behind the scenes, the role was originally for a much older actor, but when he no-showed at the last minute, Downey stepped up, as he was probably on hand, also serving as the movie's assistant art director, special effects technician, stunt performer, and transportation captain. And, like Social Intercourse, where Esley Taylor had to fill in when the original actor backed out, I can't imagine if the original guy would have given a more memorable performance. I'll be getting back to him in a minute, but suffice it to say that, while I've enjoyed many of his appearances, this is probably my favorite. Besides our leads, we have David Schick as Gail's psychiatrist Dr. Thornhill, whose filmography basically begins and ends with the Asylum, Rebecca Cochan as Francie, who also has several Asylum pictures to her name, as well as gay porn and a credit for Dark Knight Rises, Michael Tower, also from a couple Asylum movies and stuff, Kelly Swearington in her only acting role, who's more well known for her makeup work, and Asylum recurrents Jeff Denton and Dean Arvalo make cameos in this movie as well. A smaller cast than usual, but I have no problem with any of these actors. Man, it's always good to see some established returning talent. Sometimes it's the only thing keeping me coming back. The camera work is quite good for this type of movie. The low budget and grainy camera quality actually work to this movie's advantage, giving sort of a natural found footage feel, without resorting to the cheap camcorder look that the genre usually falls back on. Most of the movie is obviously still shot on a handheld, but the operators clearly knew which shots to hold on and which to shake around. When there's no action going on and the actors are just standing or sitting around, the camera is almost completely still, usually cutting back and forth depending on who's talking. When we're seeing the house, we'll get some pans and sweeps of the room while they track or locate the characters. And they're kept relatively stable, not constantly following what's in the actor's hands, like we've seen before. When the scene needs to be a little creepy, we'll get a purposely awkward angle for that extra level of uneasiness. And when everything hits the fan and things get intense, then the camera gets chaotic, jerking in different directions, spinning around the actors, shuddering and trying to focus, but all while keeping the actors in view. This is something that so many other movies seem to miss, that a camera can shake and move around for effect, but it still needs to be stable enough to see what's going on. I want to see the on-screen action, not a blurry mess, but if you can get the rhythm of the camera to match up with what we're watching, then all the better. I guess the filming can be a little claustrophobic, as a lot of shots feature the actors' faces taking up almost the entire frame, but since the focus is on how these characters are reacting to these supernatural events, they help establish mood and expression. Unlike some movies where the camera's on maximum zoom solely so we can count every pore in the actor's nose, but I digress. Even the effects are pretty good. According to Leigh Scott, they purposely stuck almost entirely to practical effects for a more horror movie feel, and most of them look convincing. We have Gail levitating on a board, we have things flying at people on strings, we have the typical blood and gore effects to drive the death scenes home, we have makeup to give that demonic melting face look, and we get a very clever set of camera tricks and wire work to make it look like Gail is actually scaling the walls and climbing on the ceiling. They're all low-budget horror tricks we've seen before, but I'll take the lowest quality practical effects over the lowest quality CGI work. Of special note is this possession effect, where it looks like they took a high-powered leaf blower and carefully dragged it across the actress's arms and face to make it appear something is literally crawling underneath her skin. It's so simple, yet so brilliant, I'm amazed I've never seen it used in anything else. Or maybe it's just a Photoshop job, but even if it is, I still believe something's happening. The scene that comes closest to being scary is when Gail is dreaming about killing her family, and we see Anne and Clark being stabbed by an invisible presence. And then it cuts to the mirror, where we see the demon taking the form of Gail performing the act, suggesting that, as ancient folklore likes to preach, mirrors are the only way to see this evil spirit. Which is given strength in the next scene, where Gail looks at herself in the mirror, walks off, and her reflection doesn't follow. Again, stuff we've seen before, but I'm a sucker for this cliche. If these effects actually added up to something, I think we could have had an interesting haunting film. You know, instead of, "Course scary, right?" Oh, and Gail's TV is possessed for 5 seconds. Again, just something that happens. That'll teach Sadako for trying to use Apple Maps. This sounds okay, I guess. Everything sounds recorded on location and in enclosed rooms, so there's a bit of reverb to all the dialogue, but not to distracting levels, and everyone's still intelligible. Even the sound effects are decent. It's clearly stock Foley, but not Foley that's been overused to the point it completely ruins the tone. Well, except for one certain sound, but we'll get back to that. And the music's not bad either. Most of the score was composed by Eliza Swenson, who, in addition to featuring in several Asylum movies, has served as primary or secondary composer on a multitude of Asylum, Leigh Scott, and other B-movies. Work she does to this day. For the most part, it's a very atmospheric strings and organ score, establishing a scary, otherworldly feeling to complement the movie's supernatural horror. But there are some places where the music feels unneeded. Like watch this scene with ambient sound. Now here it is as it's shown in the movie. Oh no! Will Clark escape the empty hallway alive? Yeah, when something's actually happening, the music sounds great. But when they're just wandering around or talking, it's best to keep those scenes silent. Which, to their credit, they do for the most part. It's just a couple parts are improperly scored, and the effect is as distracting as if they instead played this.
We represent the Lollipop Guild, the Lollipop Guild, the Lollipop Guild.
But even with some competent technical work, this movie is just not worth watching. The characters are boring and one note, the setting is uninteresting, and while the camera's well operated, I'm not a fan of the filters. Most of the movie is shown in either a sepia tone or a blue tint, possibly to suggest it's taking place early in the morning or late at night, but all they do is make it look like someone either pissed on or poured laundry detergent on the film. They're distracting, overused, and since most of the movie takes place indoors, completely unnecessary. And like I said, the movie just isn't scary. Besides some blood and a couple jump scares, there's nothing to grab your attention. Gail could have been scary, but she isn't given anything to do, except seduce Clark as crudely as possible. Yeah, there's a lot of dialogue I can in good conscience share with you. So, for most of the first hour, this movie is a complete snore. one that's made with some experience, but fails to bring the excitement, the scares, or any reason we should be involved with these characters or situation. And then we reach the third act and the exorcism itself, and the movie becomes freaking amazing. Yes, Father Bates and his assistants finally show up to banish the demon out of Gail, and they've brought a can of consecrated whoop-ass ready to pop open like the tomb of Lazarus. The next 20 minutes is just chaos. A beautiful, chaotic battle between good and evil that will only end with the extermination of one side or the other. I can't even describe most of what happens. The simple summary is that Bates tries to exorcise Gail through prayer and beating the crap out of her. And when that doesn't work, he tries prayer and beating the crap out of her. And when that doesn't work, he falls back on the trusty standby of prayer and beating the crap out of her. All while both of them scream at the top of their lungs and things are sent flying across the room. But honestly, even that description doesn't do the scene justice and comes nowhere near how intense and amazing this battle becomes. Even with the footage covered in an oversaturated tan filter, I could not take my eyes off the action for a second. I lost count of how many times Bates seems to finally banish the demon from Gail, only for the spirit to come back 10 times angrier and wreck him and his assistants up. It's a battle I have no business trying to summarize. It's something you have to see for yourself. Trust me when I say that while 20 minutes may sound like a long time, it'll be over long before you've had enough. And most of it is thanks to the incredible and intense performances of Erica Kessler and Thomas Downey. Like I said, Erica does an incredible job portraying a possessed young woman, regressing into a beast who only seeks to kill and fornicate, and nearly murdering her sister, brother-in-law, and psychiatrist. But it's this final scene where she turns the dial up to 11, screaming and swearing so loudly to the point I'm surprised this actress didn't burst a blood vessel. Her flailing, her facial contortions, the smile she gives when she's murdering Bates' assistants, everything indicates that she's going through hell and she's loving it. Gail may have been possessed by a spirit from the depths of hell, but you can't convince me Erica wasn't also possessed by a spirit of Heather from Killers 2. And then there's Thomas Downey, and he's just... wow! I've always liked this actor, especially when he takes a lead role like Jolly Roger or Beast of Bray Road, or even Shapeshifter, but his performance in this movie is on a whole other level. As Leigh Scott describes, he takes what was originally written as a much more subdued, dignified performance and plays it much more like a superhero, which I totally agree with. He's somewhat of a fallen priest who failed to perform an exorcism in the first scene, which was also awesome and something you need to see for yourself, leaving him scarred literally and figuratively, and he's lost his faith and the power to cast out devils. But it turns out that the spirit that possessed a girl in the beginning of the movie is the exact same one currently possessing Gail, and the spirit has asked for him by name, which is all the convincing he needs. Clearly the movie should have been about this guy, but he's only in the first 3 minutes, then he doesn't show up again until the last 20. Oh, but he makes up for his lack of screen time by pulling out all the stops. He goes from calm and brooding to screaming and bulgy-eyed within a matter of seconds, shout-growling his lines and contorting his face like he was possessed by the spirits of Yosemite Sam and Zack from Max Knight. All while wearing a purple cross vest even Bible Man would dismiss as overcompensating. And yet, he shows so much dedication and dignity to what could have been an undignified role, I totally believe he's a superpowered priest sent by God himself to rid the world of evil spirits. Every second he's on screen, he's putting his all into his performance, screaming and fighting as his blood vessels swell and you half expect his head to burst like scanners. Like Scott Carson in Killers, this feels like a character Downey had been waiting his entire life to play. And I buy every minute of it. Thomas Downey, you've always been one of the best parts of these Asylum movies, but with this performance, I'm pleased to place you alongside the Rhett Giles, C. Thomas Howells, Kim Littles, and Andy Lors as one of the most standout and talented performers I've ever seen. Here's hoping we get a performance of this magnitude again. I'm just saying, if DC ever wanted to reboot Constantine, this guy could probably use the work. And the rest of the actors in this scene are great as well. Especially when one is possessed by Gail and repeatedly stabs his co-worker with a holy dagger. Which becomes unintentionally hilarious with his very soft thrust and the overused squish sound played over and over again. And to top off just how crazy this last scene is, I don't even get how it ends. I don't want to spoil too much since part of the fun is how convoluted and nonsensical the explanation is. But long story short, Downey could have done something during the first exorcism. He didn't. Then he does it here, but it doesn't do anything. Then it does, I think, and the spirit is banished from Gail. Hooray! Whatever you did worked. Congratulations? Hey, don't think the movie's gonna explain it, because as soon as Gail's 100% curse-free, the end credits roll. But honestly, there was nothing else they could have done. Anything added would have just been downhill from there. Alright, movie, keep your secrets. Just know that that's gonna be one of my 3 questions I get to ask God when I meet him face to face. Did I do any good? What do I do now? And how the hell was that rite supposed to work? And if that last question is what gets me kicked out through the pearly gates and into the fiery depths below, well, I hope you know a good exorcist, because I'm coming after you. This movie is freaking awesome. And freaking boring. Yeah, I'm kind of torn on this one. It's not one of the worst Asylum movies I've seen. The production work is some of the best out of everything I've watched so far, and when it's exciting, it's exciting. But at the same time, the acting is underplayed, the filters are annoying, the script is a mess, especially when it comes to Clark and how Gail becomes possessed in the first place, and it comes nowhere close to being scary. But then along comes the exorcism scene, and it's like we're watching a completely different movie. Literally, it's like its own standalone short film. Unlike most other insane endings we've come across, it has little to do with the rest of the flick, so you could very easily watch this scene without having to worry about context. And in the end, that's what I recommend you do. Watch the beginning, watch the ending, and if you have to watch the rest, just kind of skim through it. The movie is boring as hell for the most part, but it's the first and last scenes that'll keep you in high spirits. I'll admit, the next movie in the queue has me curious. While these last few movies had elements to tie them in with the films they're cashing in on, they mostly did their own thing and followed a plot unrelated to the bigger movie. If it wasn't for their titles, I wouldn't have easily guessed what they were clearly ripping off. But for this next movie, they don't even try to hide what they're blatantly copying, and it's not exactly a title that allows for much thinking outside the box. Do they find a way to make it their own project? Or do we somehow get a scene-for-scene reenactment of the movie that wasn't even released yet? Let's find out together next time. Hey there everyone, thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider supporting me on Patreon and help me create even more content like this. It's only $1 to get early access to my videos, and only $5 gets you a credit at the end of each of those videos, with higher tiers offering these and even more perks. And as you help me reach certain goals, I have super special content lined up for all of you. Head on over and check out my Patreon today, and I'll see you next time.